Oh my God.
She thought she knew her husband. She thought she knew her best friend. But most of all, she thought she knew her father, the quiet man who spent 30 years fixing broken appliances for $20 cash and stitched his name across the pocket of a faded uniform. She was wrong about all three. When her father died, she discovered he had been worth $2,300,000,000, a fortune he had hidden from everyone, including the daughter who loved him. 48 hours later, before the funeral flowers had even wilted, her husband filed for divorce. 1 week after that, he married her best friend. But this is not a story about betrayal. This is a story about revenge served colder than anyone could imagine, because what her husband and her best friend did not know was that her father had left her one final gift, and that gift would destroy them both. For years, Sarah Mitchell believed her life had been built on honesty. She believed her marriage was solid, her friendship was real, and her father was exactly who he appeared to be, a tired man in work boots who never had enough money for anything extra. She had no idea that every sacrifice he made, every dollar he seemed to scrape together, was a performance designed to protect something far larger than she could have imagined. She had no idea that the man eating dinner across from her every night for 20 years had been quietly building an empire in the shadows, and that his silence had a purpose she would only understand after he was gone. What Sarah did not know, what none of them knew, was that grief has a way of exposing people. It strips away the version of someone you thought you loved and reveals the version that was always underneath, waiting. Her husband did not wait long. Her best friend did not hesitate either. Within days, the two people she trusted most in the world began moving with a speed that should have terrified her, a speed built not on love, but on arithmetic. They believed a fortune was coming. They believed it belonged to them now. What they failed to understand was that her father had spent his entire life reading people, and in his final act, he had read them perfectly. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This story begins not with billions, but with a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, where a little girl once cried at a kitchen table because she could not afford a school trip that cost $350. What her parents told her that night, and what she would not understand for another 30 years, would become the very foundation of the reckoning that was coming for the two people who thought they had already won. To understand how a marriage built on 20 years of shared mornings could collapse in 48 hours, you have to ask the questions that no one around Sarah was asking at the time. Why had her father, a man who repaired dishwashers for cash and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, been sitting on a fortune large enough to reshape an entire family's future? What made him choose silence over comfort, poverty over truth, for 3 full decades? And if he had that kind of money the entire time, why did he let his daughter believe, for her whole childhood, that there simply wasn't enough? There is a second question, harder to answer, because it requires looking at two people Sarah loved without flinching. What does it take for a husband to file divorce papers before his wife has finished grieving her father? What does it take for a best friend, someone who sat beside her at that same funeral, to already be planning a wedding 1 week later? These are not the actions of people caught in a moment of weakness. These are the actions of people who had been waiting, perhaps longer than anyone realized, for exactly this kind of opportunity. Consider for a moment what it truly takes to plan a wedding in the span of 7 days. Marriage licenses require processing time. Venues require booking. Whatever arrangements David and Jennifer made in that single week had almost certainly been discussed, and likely decided well before Robert Mitchell ever took his final breath. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail buried inside this entire story, more unsettling in some ways than the affair itself. It suggests that the two people closest to Sarah were not simply reacting to a fortune once it appeared. They were anticipating it, calculating around it, waiting for the exact moment when grief would make Sarah least equipped to notice what was quietly already in motion around her. And then there is the question that sits underneath all the others, the one that will not be answered until much later in this story. What was the final gift Robert Mitchell left behind? Not the money itself, because inheritances are divided every day without consequence. Something else, something specific enough and precise enough that it would not simply pass wealth from father to daughter, but would expose exactly who deserved it and who never did. Robert had spent his life watching people closely, reading their patience, their greed, their loyalty when nothing was being offered. In the end, he built one last test, and two people were about to fail it in front of the entire world. Sarah Mitchell grew up in a world where every penny counted. Her childhood home in Dayton was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch-style house with a chain-link fence and a driveway that desperately needed repaving. Her father, Robert, worked as a building maintenance supervisor at a commercial complex downtown. He left the house every morning at 6:30 sharp, lunch pail in hand, wearing the same faded blue uniform that had his name stitched across the breast pocket. Her mother, Linda, spent her days serving mashed potatoes and green beans in the cafeteria at Jefferson Elementary School. They weren't poor, but they certainly weren't comfortable. Every grocery trip involved coupons clipped from the Sunday paper. Every Christmas meant handmade gifts and creative explanations about why Santa had a budget that year. The house on Maple Hollow Drive was small enough that Sarah could hear her parents' conversations through the thin walls of her bedroom at night. Quiet discussions about which bill to pay first, whether the car would make it through another winter, whether there was room in the budget for new shoes before the old ones fell apart completely. She never once heard either of her parents raise their voice about money. She only ever heard the low, steady hum of two people quietly managing scarcity together, a rhythm she absorbed so completely that she carried it into her own adult life without ever questioning where it came from. Sarah learned early that wanting something and getting something were two very different things. She watched her father fix neighbors' broken appliances in the evenings for $20 cash, money that would go straight into the jar labeled Sarah's college fund that sat on top of the refrigerator. She remembered being 12 years old and crying because she couldn't go on the 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. The cost was $350, and her parents sat her down at the kitchen table to explain, with gentle voices and tired eyes, that the money simply wasn't there. She remembered nodding, pretending she understood, and then crying quietly into her pillow that night so they wouldn't hear. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her father sat in his truck outside their house for 20 minutes after that conversation, gripping the steering wheel, forcing himself not to write a check that would have solved the problem in an instant. Robert Mitchell had the money. He had always had the money. What he did not have, and what he refused to risk, was a daughter who grew up believing that the world simply handed you whatever you wanted. He wanted her to understand the value of struggle before she ever understood the weight of wealth. And so he let her cry, and he let himself carry the guilt of it alone, believing it was the only way to raise someone who would not be destroyed by what was coming for her one day. One particular memory Sarah returned to often, in the months after learning the truth, involved a summer when she was 15 and had taken a job scooping ice cream at a shop 2 miles from their house, riding her bike there and back every shift because the family's second car had finally given out for good. A regular customer, an older woman who came in most Saturdays, once slipped Sarah an extra $10 tip and told her she reminded her of her own granddaughter, a moment of small, unexpected kindness that Sarah still remembered vividly decades later. She came home glowing that evening, proud of the $11 she had earned in tips on top of her hourly wage, and Robert had listened to the entire story with rapt attention, asking follow-up questions about which flavors sold fastest and how she handled a rude customer earlier in the shift, treating her small summer job with the same seriousness he might have given a business partner reporting quarterly earnings. It was only years later that Sarah understood her father had likely made more money that single afternoon from a single real estate closing than she would earn in that entire summer combined, and that he had never once let that disparity show in his face while she talked. There were other moments like it over the years, moments Sarah would only recognize in hindsight, decades later, as small, deliberate acts of restraint from a man capable of erasing every hardship his family faced with a single phone call. When Sarah broke her arm falling off her bike at age 9, Robert drove her to the county hospital instead of the private clinic across town, explaining patiently that the county hospital took their insurance and the other one didn't. When she wanted to try out for competitive gymnastics at 14, a sport that required expensive private coaching, her parents gently steered her toward the free program at the community center instead, telling her the discipline would matter more than the label on the gym. Sarah never resented any of it. If anything, these small disappointments taught her patience, humility, and a quiet gratitude for whatever she did manage to have. qualities that would define her long after she became, on paper, one of the wealthiest women in the state of Ohio. Robert had not always been a man of hidden fortune. He had grown up even poorer than the life he built for Sarah, the son of a coal miner named Earl Mitchell in a small town in West Virginia, where the mountains were beautiful and the work underground slowly killed the men who did it. Earl died of black lung when Robert was 16, coughing blood into a handkerchief in the back bedroom of a house with no running hot water. Robert watched his mother take in laundry from 3 other families just to keep the lights on, and he made a private vow, standing at his father's graveside in a suit borrowed from a neighbor, that he would never again feel as powerless as he had felt watching a man who worked harder than anyone he ever knew die broke and forgotten. He left home at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and a stubborn belief that the world owed him nothing, but that he could still take from it whatever he was willing to earn. He worked construction in Charleston, then moved north for factory work in Akron, and eventually settled in Dayton, where he took the maintenance job that would remain his public identity for the rest of his life. What almost no one knew, not his co-workers, not his neighbors, not even Linda in the beginning, was that Robert had started investing small amounts of money into distressed real estate in his mid-20s, buying foreclosed properties that other men dismissed as worthless and slowly restoring them for resale. He had an instinct, a quiet, almost eerie ability to see value where others saw only ruin, and over the following decade, that instinct compounded into something much larger than anyone around him could have imagined. His first real break came at 26, when a retiring landlord named Walter Pruitt, a man Robert had done odd repair jobs for on the side, offered to sell him a rundown 4-unit apartment building for almost nothing, mostly because no one else in town wanted the headache of fixing it. Robert spent every evening for 4 months after his regular shift rewiring outlets, patching plaster, and replacing rotted floorboards himself, refusing to hire out labor he could learn to do on his own. Walter, impressed by the young man's discipline, became an informal mentor, teaching Robert how to read a balance sheet, how to negotiate with a bank, how to recognize a neighborhood on the edge of turning around before anyone else noticed. Walter would often invite Robert to sit with him on Sunday afternoons at his kitchen table, walking him through old rent rolls and tax records, quizzing him on which repairs were worth the money and which were simply a landlord's vanity, sharpening an instinct in Robert that would eventually prove more valuable than any single property he acquired. It was Walter who first told Robert during one of these Sunday sessions that the surest way to lose everything he built was to let people know how much of it he actually had, a piece of advice Walter had learned the hard way after a cousin of his own had been sued twice by distant relatives, once word spread of a modest inheritance. Robert took the lesson far more literally and far more permanently than Walter likely ever intended, but he would say, decades later, that it was the single most valuable piece of advice anyone ever gave him. Robert never forgot that kindness. Decades later, long after Walter had passed away, Robert quietly paid off the mortgage on Walter's daughter's home without ever telling her where the money came from, a small, private repayment for a debt he considered far larger than money could measure. By his early 30s, Robert had reinvested every dollar of profit from that first building into 3 more properties, then 5, then a small logistics company that hauled freight between Dayton and Columbus, a business he acquired almost by accident when its previous owner defaulted on a loan Robert had quietly co-signed as a favor to a friend. He learned the shipping business the same way he had learned everything else, by working alongside his own employees rather than above them, driving routes himself in the early years, learning which warehouses were mismanaged and which routes were underpriced, building an intuition for logistics that no business school could have taught him. It was this same intuition, applied patiently and privately over 3 more decades, that eventually grew into the controlling stakes in 4 regional shipping and logistics companies that would form the backbone of his fortune. There was a specific moment, Robert would later tell Charles Whitfield, that convinced him to hide his growing wealth entirely rather than let it be known. In his early 30s, a distant cousin of his had inherited a modest sum, roughly $40,000, from an aunt's life insurance policy. Within 18 months, that same cousin had lost his marriage, alienated his adult children, and been sued twice by so-called friends claiming they were owed a share. Robert watched this unfold from a distance and understood something that would shape the next 4 decades of his life. Money did not simply solve problems. It revealed exactly who a person already was, and it accelerated whatever was already present, good or rotten, inside the people surrounding them. Robert decided, quietly and permanently, that if he was ever going to build real wealth, he would build it in total secrecy, using it to protect the people he loved rather than expose them to the particular corrosion that sudden fortune seemed to bring out in almost everyone who touched it. Over the following 3 decades, working through a private holding company registered under a name that bore no connection to his own, Robert built a portfolio of undervalued real estate, a controlling stake in 4 regional shipping and logistics companies, and a diversified investment fund managed by a small, discreet firm in Columbus that had signed confidentiality agreements so restrictive that violating them meant forfeiting 7-figure retainers. He told no one, not even Linda, the full extent of what he had built. Linda knew there was money set aside, money that would eventually help Sarah, but even she believed it was in the low millions at most, enough for a comfortable retirement and a modest inheritance, never imagining the true number stretched into the billions. Robert guarded this secret not out of paranoia, but out of a lifetime of watching what money did to people, how it changed the way they looked at each other, how it turned love into calculation. He wanted his daughter to be loved for exactly who she was, not for what she might someday be worth, and so he buried the truth as deep as he could, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps waiting for a moment he hoped would never come at all. Robert met Linda in his late 20s, not long after acquiring that first apartment building from Walter Pruitt at a small church social in Dayton that he had only attended because a coworker dragged him along. Linda was working as a cafeteria assistant even then, quick-witted and unimpressed by the quiet, serious young man who kept glancing at her from across the room. She would later say that what drew her to Robert was not charm, because he had very little of it in the traditional sense, but a kind of steadiness she had never encountered in anyone else her age, a sense that he thought carefully about everything before he said it out loud. They married 2 years later in a ceremony even smaller than the one Robert would eventually pay for Sarah, a gathering of 40 people in the same small church basement where they had met, with a reception that consisted of homemade casseroles and a borrowed record player. In those early years, Linda had no reason to suspect Robert was building anything beyond a stable, modest life for the two of them. He worked long hours, came home covered in drywall dust or grease depending on the week, and never once mentioned the apartment buildings or the freight company he was slowly acquiring on the side. When Linda occasionally asked where he disappeared to on weekends, Robert would simply say he was helping a friend with a project, a vague explanation she accepted without much question, trusting him the way partners in a good marriage often trust each other, without demanding an accounting of every hour. It was only decades later, once everything came to light, that Linda understood exactly how much her husband had been carrying alone, and how much of that solitude had been a choice he made specifically to protect the life they had built together. Linda Mitchell, for her part, spent 30 years believing she had married a good, simple man who worked hard and loved his family fiercely, which was entirely true, even if it was not the complete truth. She never once suspected the scale of what Robert had built, and in later years, after everything came to light, she would say that she did not feel betrayed by his secrecy, only humbled by the depth of what he had sacrificed emotionally in order to protect them. Robert's discipline around his secrecy extended into details so small that even Charles Whitfield, who managed his affairs for 2 decades, occasionally found them almost comical in hindsight. Robert never once used a phone at home to discuss anything related to his holdings, always driving to a payphone outside a hardware store on the edge of town in the early years, and later, once he reluctantly adopted a cell phone, keeping a second, entirely separate device locked in his truck that Linda never knew existed. He filed his taxes personally, rather than through a local accountant who might recognize discrepancies between his reported lifestyle and his reported income, working instead with a firm 2 states away that had no reason to ever cross paths with anyone in Dayton. He kept his work uniform impeccably maintained for 30 years, mending the same 3 shirts himself rather than replacing them, not out of necessity, but because he understood, with an almost strategic precision, that a well-kept, modest wardrobe told a more convincing story than any effort at true poverty ever could. Charles once asked him, during one of their early meetings, whether he ever grew tired of the performance, and Robert told him without hesitation that it stopped feeling like a performance within the first few years, that the version of himself wearing the uniform and driving the old truck had simply become the truest version of who he actually was, a man who valued the dignity of honest work, regardless of what sat quietly in his investment accounts. The fortune, he said, was simply a tool he was building for someone else's future. The life he actually wanted to live, the one with coupon-clipped groceries and evening appliance repairs, was never a sacrifice at all. It was the life he had chosen on purpose, and the life he intended his daughter to understand the value of long before she ever learned what he had built underneath it. She remembered small things differently once she understood the full picture. The way Robert would sometimes disappear for a weekend claiming he was helping a friend with a construction project. The way he insisted on handling all the family's paperwork himself. The way he seemed to know, with unsettling precision, exactly how to navigate conversations with bankers and lawyers that a simple maintenance man should never have had reason to understand. Sarah met David Callahan when she was 24 years old, working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising firm in Columbus. David worked one floor above her in business development, and their first real conversation happened in a crowded elevator during a fire drill, an ordinary, almost forgettable moment that Sarah would later describe as the beginning of the happiest and most painful decade of her life. David was ambitious in a way that impressed her immediately. Charming, quick with a joke, always dressed a step above everyone else in the room, the kind of man who seemed to walk into any space already certain he belonged there. He came from a family with modest means as well, raised by a single mother in a small apartment outside Cincinnati, though he never spoke about his childhood the way Sarah spoke about hers, with warmth and gratitude. David spoke about his past with something closer to resentment, a quiet hunger to never again be the poorest person at the table, a hunger Sarah mistook, in those early years, for simple motivation. They dated for 3 years before David proposed on a weekend trip to Charleston, South Carolina, a city he chose deliberately because he had read that it photographed beautifully for engagement pictures, a detail Sarah found charming at the time and would only later recognize as an early sign of a man who thought carefully about how things appeared, rather than simply how they felt. He proposed on a horse-drawn carriage ride through the historic district, timing the moment so precisely that a photographer he had secretly hired was waiting at exactly the right angle to capture it, a level of orchestration Sarah found romantic in the moment and unsettling only in hindsight. Once she understood how much of David's life, even in its most intimate corners, was quietly staged for an audience he imagined watching. There had been small warning signs even in those early years that Sarah, deeply in love and inclined toward generosity in her interpretations, chose not to examine too closely. David had once, during their second year of dating, grown coldly distant for nearly a week after learning that Sarah's college roommate had become engaged to a surgeon, offering no explanation beyond vague irritability, until Sarah finally pressed him and he admitted, almost sheepishly, that it made him feel behind in some race he couldn't quite name. Sarah had comforted him that night, told him their timeline was their own and mattered more than anyone else's, and David had seemed to genuinely absorb the reassurance, softening within days. She would remember that night many times in the years to come, wondering whether the softening had ever been real or simply strategic, a pattern of behavior calibrated specifically to keep her comfort and reassurance flowing in his direction. They married the following year in a small ceremony at a banquet hall outside Dayton that Robert quietly paid for in full, without ever revealing how easily he could have afforded something far grander. Sarah remembered her father dancing with her at the reception, holding her a little too tightly, whispering into her ear that he hoped she knew exactly what she was choosing, a comment she brushed off at the time as ordinary fatherly sentimentality, never suspecting it carried a weight far heavier than the moment allowed her to understand. In the early years of their marriage, David worked in commercial real estate, climbing steadily but never quite as fast as he wanted. He often joked, in a tone that was only half joking, about marrying into money one day, about how nice it would be to stop grinding and simply arrive somewhere the way certain people around him seemed to. Sarah always laughed these comments off, assuming he meant nothing by them, assuming that beneath the jokes was simply a man tired from long hours and modest commissions. She did not know that David had, early in their marriage, quietly hired a private investigator under the guise of a background check, curious about Robert's true financial standing, only to come away frustrated and confused by how little the investigator could uncover. Robert's fortune was so carefully hidden behind shell companies and discreet legal structures that even a trained professional could not locate it. And David eventually gave up the search, concluding, wrongly and with a note of quiet disappointment he never fully admitted even to himself, that his father-in-law truly was just a maintenance man with modest retirement savings. Over the years that followed, David's career stalled in ways that quietly gnawed at him. Colleagues he had once outperformed were promoted past him. A commercial deal he spent 2 years cultivating fell through at the final signature, costing him a commission he had already mentally spent. He began, without ever fully articulating it even to himself, to measure his own worth against a shifting, invisible scoreboard, one where other men's success felt like a personal referendum on his own inadequacy. Sarah watched him grow quieter over dinner, more short-tempered over small inconveniences, more prone to scrolling through the profiles of former classmates who had started companies or bought lake houses. She attributed this to ordinary midlife stress, the kind she assumed every marriage weathered eventually, and she doubled down on being supportive, patient, and endlessly encouraging, never once suspecting that patience and encouragement were, to a man like David, simply confirmation that she would tolerate almost anything. There was a specific evening 3 years before Robert's diagnosis that Sarah would later replay many times in her mind. David had come home furious after learning that a former college roommate, a man he considered far less talented than himself, had just sold a small logistics startup for $11 million. David spent the entire dinner in a simmering, barely contained irritation, snapping at Sarah over a minor comment about rescheduling a dentist appointment, then retreating to the garage for nearly 2 hours afterward, ostensibly to work on the car, but really, Sarah suspected even then, simply to be alone with his own frustration. She remembered standing in the kitchen doorway watching him through the garage window, wondering for the first time in their marriage whether the man she had built a life with measured his own worth entirely against a scoreboard she could not see and had no way of helping him win. It was around this same period that David began spending more time texting Jennifer under the guise of planning surprises for Sarah. Birthday dinners, anniversary trips, small gestures that Sarah appreciated without ever questioning how frequently the two of them seemed to be coordinating outside of her presence. She remembered feeling grateful, at the time, that her husband and her best friend got along so well, thinking it made her family feel more complete, rather than recognizing it as the early architecture of something being built specifically to exclude her. There was one particular anniversary, their 15th, when David surprised Sarah with a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in the Hocking Hills, a genuinely thoughtful gesture that Sarah treasured for years afterward, never knowing that Jennifer had been the one to research and book the entire trip on David's behalf. The two of them exchanging dozens of messages over several weeks, coordinating every detail down to the specific room, with the best view of the gorge. Sarah found the trip in an old photo album more than 2 years after everything fell apart. Sitting on the floor of her apartment surrounded by boxes she was finally ready to sort through, and she remembered staring at a photograph of herself smiling on that gorge overlook for a long time, trying to reconcile the genuine happiness she felt in that exact moment with the quiet betrayal that had, unbeknownst to her, already been years in the making by the time the picture was taken. Sarah's best friend, Jennifer Ashford, entered her life in her late 20s, introduced through a mutual coworker at a company holiday party. Jennifer was warm, funny, endlessly supportive in the way that made her easy to trust completely. She remembered birthdays. She showed up during hard weeks with wine and takeout, and no judgment. She had gone through a difficult divorce of her own in her early 30s, one that left her financially strained and emotionally cautious. And Sarah, moved by Jennifer's vulnerability, became one of the few people Jennifer let close during those years. Over the following decade, Jennifer became something closer to family than friend, present at holidays, present during Robert's earlier health scares, present at nearly every major milestone in Sarah's adult life, from her wedding to her 30th birthday, to the quiet, private grief of 2 miscarriages Sarah had only ever told Jennifer about in full detail. Jennifer's own life, in the years leading up to Robert's death, had quietly stalled in ways she rarely discussed openly. Even with Sarah, her divorce settlement had left her with far less than she expected, tied up for years in a dispute over her ex-husband's business, and she worked as an office manager at a dental practice, a job that paid steadily but modestly, nowhere near enough to fund the lifestyle she had once imagined for herself in her 20s. She watched Sarah's life, the steady marriage, the family home, the easy financial cushion Robert quietly provided without Sarah even realizing how much of it traced back to him, with a complicated mixture of genuine affection and a quiet, corrosive envy she rarely allowed herself to name, even in her own private thoughts. Friends who knew Jennifer in those years would later describe her as someone who spoke about Sarah's life with a strange, clipped tone whenever money came up, a tone that most people mistook for ordinary financial stress, rather than the early signs of something far more calculated taking shape underneath it. Sarah trusted Jennifer with things she barely told her own husband: quiet fears about her marriage, private doubts about whether David truly loved her or simply loved the idea of a stable, comfortable life. She confided in Jennifer about David's growing resentment, his comments about money, the strange, restless energy that had crept into their marriage over the past several years. The deepest of these confidences came during the 2 miscarriages Sarah experienced in her early 30s, losses that she and David rarely discussed openly with each other, let alone with extended family, each of them grieving in private, parallel silence that slowly widened the distance between them rather than closing it. It was Jennifer who sat with Sarah on the bathroom floor the night of the second loss, holding her while she cried in a way she had not allowed even David to witness. And it was Jennifer who drove her to follow up appointments in the weeks afterward, when David, uncomfortable with the raw weight of it, quietly buried himself deeper into work. Sarah would later look back on that entire period with a particular kind of anguish, recognizing that the very tenderness she believed had bonded her most closely to Jennifer had also, simultaneously, been deepening whatever bond was already quietly forming between Jennifer and David. 2 people drawn together in part by their shared, private observation of a marriage slowly coming apart at its seams during Sarah's most vulnerable season. She had no idea that Jennifer had been listening to these confessions for years, filing them away, learning exactly where the cracks in Sarah's marriage were forming, and learning, more specifically, exactly how to position herself as the one person who understood David's frustrations better than his own wife seemed to. What Sarah never noticed, because she had no reason to look for it, was the particular way David and Jennifer had begun interacting over the past several years. A familiarity that extended slightly beyond simple friendship. A hand that lingered a moment too long during a hug. A private joke shared between the 2 of them that Sarah wasn't included in. Text messages that Jennifer would quickly close when Sarah walked into the room, explained away as work stress or family drama. There had been a work trip David took to Chicago, 18 months before Robert's death. A trip Jennifer had also happened to be traveling for, around the same time for an unrelated reason. A coincidence Sarah never once thought twice about at the time. Sarah dismissed these small moments the way people in happy marriages often do, choosing trust over suspicion, choosing the comfort of assumption over the discomfort of asking hard questions. She loved her husband. She loved her best friend. And love, she believed, was its own kind of proof. Robert Mitchell's health began declining in the spring, 3 years after his 70th birthday. It started small. Fatigue he blamed on age. A persistent cough he attributed to the cold Ohio winter, refusing to let go. By early summer, after weeks of Linda quietly insisting he see a doctor, the diagnosis came back as pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable. Sarah remembered sitting in the oncologist's office holding her father's weathered hand, watching him receive the kind of news that ends a life in months rather than years, and feeling something break inside her chest that she knew would never fully heal. Robert took the diagnosis with the same quiet composure he brought to everything else in his life, thanking the doctor politely, asking practical questions about timelines and treatment options, and then driving himself home afterward, refusing to let Sarah cancel her work meetings to sit with him. In the weeks that followed, Robert made a decision that surprised no one who knew him well. He chose comfort care over aggressive treatment, telling Linda and Sarah plainly that he had no interest in spending his final months attached to machines, chasing a handful of extra weeks. He wanted, he said, to spend whatever time remained sitting on his back porch, tending the small vegetable garden he had kept for 30 years, and watching his daughter's face when she visited, memorizing details he had somehow never allowed himself to fully appreciate while he was busy building a fortune he intended to reveal only when he was gone. In the final months of his life, Robert made several trips to a law office in downtown Columbus, trips he never explained to Sarah beyond calling them paperwork, waving away her questions with the same gentle deflection he had used for 30 years. What she did not know was that these visits were the culmination of decades of planning, the final architecture of a plan Robert had been quietly constructing since the day Sarah was born. He met repeatedly with his estate attorney, a man named Charles Whitfield who had served Robert loyally for over 20 years, and who was bound by confidentiality agreements so severe that Charles himself sometimes lost sleep over the weight of what he knew and could never share. Robert restructured trusts, adjusted beneficiary language, and built specific conditions into his will, with a precision that suggested he was not simply distributing wealth, but designing a mechanism, one that would only activate under very specific circumstances he seemed to anticipate with unsettling accuracy. Charles would later admit, once everything had come to light, that he had gently pushed back against Robert during one of these final meetings, asking whether it was truly necessary to build such elaborate protective conditions into the trust, rather than simply leaving Sarah the estate outright. Robert had answered him with a tired, knowing smile, telling Charles that he had watched his daughter's marriage for years with a father's quiet, uneasy instinct, and that he would rather be wrong and overly cautious than right and unprepared. He told Charles that money reveals character faster than almost anything else in life, and that he intended his final gift to his daughter to be not just financial security, but clarity, delivered at the exact moment she would need it most. During these final months, Sarah noticed something in her father's demeanor that she couldn't quite name. He seemed, despite the diagnosis, strangely at peace, almost relieved, as though a burden he had carried for 30 years was finally being set down. One evening in late August, sitting together on the back porch while Linda made dinner inside, Robert took Sarah's hand and told her something she would not fully understand until months later. He said that people show you who they really are the moment they believe no one important is watching anymore, and that money, more than any other force he had encountered in his life, had a way of making people believe exactly that. He told her to remember that, and to trust her own eyes over her own hopes when the time came. At the time, Sarah assumed he was speaking in general terms, offering fatherly wisdom the way dying parents often do. She had no idea he was speaking with devastating specificity about two people who were about to prove him right. Charles Whitfield had known Robert Mitchell for over 20 years by the time the diagnosis came, having first met him when Robert quietly hired him to draft the confidentiality agreements protecting his earliest real estate holdings. Charles was, by his own account, initially skeptical of the modest-looking maintenance supervisor who walked into his office asking questions about complex trust structures most of his wealthy clients barely understood themselves. That skepticism dissolved within the first meeting. Once Charles realized Robert had already read every relevant statute himself and simply wanted a lawyer sharp enough to keep pace with him rather than explain the basics. Over the following 2 decades, the two men developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and an almost total absence of small talk, meeting quarterly to review the growing portfolio, adjust the protective structures around it, and discuss, in increasingly specific detail as the years passed, exactly how Robert wanted his eventual estate to be handled. It was roughly 3 years before his diagnosis that Robert first raised the idea of commissioning a private investigation into the people closest to Sarah, a request Charles initially found uncomfortable, even invasive, until Robert explained his reasoning with the same quiet, unhurried logic he brought to every major decision of his life. Robert told Charles that he had watched David for over a decade, watched the way he spoke about money, watched the particular flicker of resentment that crossed his face whenever someone else's success came up in conversation, and that his instincts, sharpened by decades of reading people in negotiations, most of them never knew they were part of, told him something was quietly wrong beneath the surface of his daughter's marriage. Charles reminded him that instinct alone was not evidence, and Robert agreed, which was precisely why he wanted the investigation, conducted lawfully and discreetly through a licensed firm, to either confirm or dissolve the suspicion before he built his final wishes around it. The investigation, conducted over 18 months by a small firm in Columbus that specialized in pre-estate due diligence for high-net-worth families, uncovered nothing definitive in its early phases, only a pattern of financial behavior that struck the investigators as worth continued monitoring. Unusual credit inquiries, a private loan application that was later withdrawn, a series of high-risk investment transfers that did not match David's publicly known income. It was only in the final 6 months before Robert's diagnosis that the investigation uncovered the falsified loan documents in full, evidence Robert reviewed personally, alone, in Charles Whitfield's office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, reading through bank statements and forged pay stubs with the same still, unreadable expression he brought to every difficult moment of his life. Charles would later say it was the only time in 20 years he saw Robert's hands visibly shake while reviewing a document, not out of anger, but out of grief, for a daughter who did not yet know what was coming. There was another conversation, one Sarah would only recall clearly in the aftermath of everything that followed, in which Robert asked her, almost casually, how she thought David would react if she ever came into a large sum of money unexpectedly. Sarah remembered laughing and saying David would probably want to buy a boat, a joke that made her father smile in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. She did not think anything of it at the time. Grief and exhaustion had a way of dulling the sharp edges of memory, and it was only much later, replaying that conversation again and again, that Sarah understood her father had been testing the waters of a suspicion he never once voiced directly, protecting her from the pain of hearing it until he no longer had a choice. A few weeks after that conversation, on one of his better days, Robert asked Sarah to sit with him a little longer after Linda had gone inside to start dinner. He told her, in a tone more serious than his usual gentle deflections, that he needed her to promise him something, though he refused to explain exactly what it was for. He asked her to promise that no matter what happened after he was gone, no matter how confusing or painful things might become, she would trust her own judgment over anyone else's reassurances, including, he added with a small, tired laugh, his own. Sarah promised, mostly to ease what she assumed was simply a dying man's anxiety about leaving his family behind, never once suspecting that her father was quietly asking her to hold on to a piece of armor he had spent years forging, specifically for the moment he would no longer be there to protect her himself. In his final 2 weeks, Robert grew too weak to sit on the back porch he loved, and the family moved him to a hospice facility outside Columbus, known for its quiet, home-like rooms, and its wraparound porches overlooking a small pond. Sarah took a leave of absence from work to be there every day, sitting beside his bed reading to him from old paperback westerns he had loved since childhood, the same worn novels he used to read to her when she was small. Linda slept in a cot beside his bed most nights, unwilling to leave his side even when the nurses gently encouraged her to rest. There were good days in those final 2 weeks, afternoons when Robert seemed almost like himself, cracking dry jokes with the hospice nurses, asking Sarah pointed questions about her job and her marriage, that she now understood, in hindsight, were far more searching than she realized at the time. And there were harder days, days of long silences and labored breathing, days when Sarah sat holding his hand, simply because she did not know what else to do with the fear building steadily inside her chest. Robert Mitchell passed away on a Tuesday morning in early October, surrounded by Linda and Sarah at a hospice facility outside Columbus, in a room made deliberately warm and quiet at his own request. His final words, according to Sarah, were simple. He told her he loved her, that he was proud of the woman she had become, and that everything he had ever done, he had done to protect her, even the parts that had hurt her at the time, even the parts she would not understand for a long while yet. Sarah held his hand until the machines confirmed what she already felt in the silence of the room, a stillness that settled over her like something physical, something she would carry in her chest for months afterward. The funeral was held 5 days later, a modest service attended by nearly 200 people, far more than Sarah expected, neighbors and former co-workers, and members of a small local charity Robert had quietly supported for years, under an assumed name that no one, including Sarah, connected to him until much later. It was a gathering of people who had known Robert as exactly what he appeared to be, a humble, hard-working man who had given everything he had to his family and quietly to his community, never once suspecting the scale of what he had truly built. Sarah delivered the eulogy herself, her voice breaking only once, when she described her father teaching her to ride a bike on the cracked driveway of the Maple Hollow Drive house, running alongside her for what felt like miles, refusing to let go of the seat until he was certain she could balance entirely on her own, and then letting go anyway, trusting her to fall and get back up if she needed to. She told the room that her father had taught her everything she knew about patience, about quiet dignity, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching to reward you for it, and that she hoped, in whatever years she had left, to live up to the example he had set. She had no idea, standing at that podium, how literally her father had built his entire final act around exactly that lesson. Several of Robert's former co-workers from the maintenance crew he had supervised for over 2 decades approached Sarah after the service, sharing small memories she had never heard before. The time Robert had spent an entire Saturday teaching a young apprentice how to properly wire a circuit breaker without ever once losing his patience. The way he always remembered which employees had kids with birthdays coming up and would quietly slip them an extra half-day off without ever making a show of the kindness. One older man, a retired electrician named Frank, who had worked alongside Robert for nearly 15 years, told Sarah that Robert had once loaned him rent money during a rough patch in the 90s, waving off repayment for months until Frank insisted, and that Robert had never once, in 15 years of friendship, mentioned it again or let it change how he treated him. Sarah collected these small stories carefully in the weeks that followed, writing them down in the same journal Dr. Patel would later encourage her to keep, understanding, even before she knew the full truth of her father's fortune, that the man being described in these stories was somehow both smaller and vastly larger than the modest maintenance supervisor she had always believed him to be. An elderly man Sarah didn't recognize approached her after the service, introducing himself only as someone Robert had helped years earlier, declining to elaborate further before disappearing into the parking lot. It was a small, strange moment that Sarah nearly forgot entirely, until months later, when Charles Whitfield would reveal the extent of the anonymous charitable giving Robert had conducted for over 20 years, quietly covering medical bills, funding scholarships, and rescuing small local businesses from foreclosure, all of it channeled through a private foundation that bore no trace of his name. Charles walked Sarah through a folder of these stories during one of their later meetings, cases the foundation had quietly funded over the decades that Robert had never once mentioned at home. There was a family in East Dayton whose mortgage Robert had paid in full after the father lost his job during a factory closure, the payment arriving through the foundation with a note simply stating it was a community grant, no explanation offered beyond that. There was a young man from the same neighborhood Sarah grew up in, whose community college tuition had been quietly covered for 2 full years after his own father died unexpectedly. A young man who went on to become a nurse, and who, Charles mentioned almost as an aside, was the elderly man's grandson, the same man who had approached Sarah so briefly at the funeral. There was a small hardware store on the edge of downtown Dayton that Robert had personally rescued from foreclosure twice over 15 years, quietly buying the building itself and leasing it back to the owner at a fraction of market rate rather than let the business close and put 6 employees out of work. None of these families ever knew the source of the help that arrived at exactly the moment they needed it most, and Robert had insisted every single time that it remain that way. Sarah asked Charles, sitting in his office turning the pages of that folder, why her father had never once told her about any of it, not even in his final weeks when there was nothing left to protect. Charles considered the question for a long moment before answering, telling her that in his experience, the people who most needed the world to know about their generosity were rarely the ones whose generosity meant anything at all, and that Robert, more than any client he had worked with in 30 years of practice, seemed to genuinely believe that good done in secret carried a different, quieter kind of weight than good done for an audience. David stood beside Sarah throughout the funeral, his hand on her back, his expression appropriately somber, accepting condolences from mourners with the practiced ease of a man who understood exactly how a grieving husband was supposed to look. Jennifer sat in the second row beside Linda, dabbing at her eyes, embracing Sarah tightly afterward, and whispering that she would be there for whatever Sarah needed in the coming weeks. Words that Sarah would replay in her mind many months later, with a bitterness she could not have imagined feeling on that particular afternoon. Neither David nor Jennifer knew, standing among the modest gathering of mourners, that Robert's estate attorney was already preparing to contact Sarah, and that the number about to be revealed would change every quiet calculation they had been making about their futures. Calculations that had, unbeknownst to Sarah, already begun long before her father ever took his last breath. 3 days after the funeral, Charles Whitfield called Sarah and asked her to come to his office alone, a request Sarah found slightly unusual but attributed to standard legal formality. She assumed it was routine paperwork, perhaps a life insurance policy, or the deed to the house on Maple Hollow Drive. She sat across from Charles in a leather chair in his quiet, book-lined office, still exhausted from grief, and listened as he explained, choosing his words with visible care, that her father's estate, accumulated over 3 decades through real estate holdings, private equity investments, and a controlling stake in 4 regional shipping and logistics companies, was valued at approximately $2.3 billion. Sarah later said she asked Charles to repeat the number twice, certain she had misheard him, certain there had been some clerical error, some mistake involving another family's fortune accidentally attached to her father's name. There had been no error. Her father, the man who wore a faded uniform and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, had quietly become one of the wealthiest men in the state of Ohio, and he had never once let his own daughter know, not even during his final months, when he had every reason and every opportunity to finally tell her the truth. Charles explained, gently, that Robert had left explicit instructions that the size of the estate not be disclosed to anyone, including David, until Sarah herself had time to process the information privately and completely. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that certain provisions in the trust would not become clear until a later date, phrasing it carefully enough that Sarah, still reeling, did not think to press further in her grief-stricken state. She left the office in a daze, driving home in silence, trying to reconcile 30 years of clip coupons and second-hand furniture with a fortune large enough to reshape the course of her entire family's future. She decided, in the privacy of her own mind, to take time before telling David the full number, wanting to sit with the shock of it alone first, to understand it fully before she had to watch someone else's face change in response to it. That decision, made quietly and without any strategic intent whatsoever, would end up being the single detail that exposed everything that came next. What Sarah didn't realize was that David had grown suspicious the moment she returned from Charles Whitfield's office, withdrawn and unusually quiet. He pressed her gently over dinner that night, asking what the attorney had said, and Sarah, still processing the enormity of what she'd learned, told him only that the estate was larger than they had expected, but that she needed a few days before discussing details fully. To David, a man who had spent 2 decades quietly wondering about his father-in-law's true worth, this hesitation read as confirmation of something enormous. He did not know the exact number, but he knew, with sudden and complete certainty, that his wife was now sitting on more money than he had ever imagined possible. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life resenting the pace of his own climb, that certainty changed everything within 48 hours. What Sarah did not know, in those first raw days after her father's death, was that David's financial situation had quietly become far more desperate than she ever suspected. 18 months earlier, David had used falsified income documents to secure a substantial private loan, money he funneled into a series of speculative investments he was certain would finally deliver the kind of windfall that would let him stop grinding entirely. The investments had failed, one after another, over the course of a single brutal year, leaving David not just disappointed, but quietly, catastrophically in debt, drowning under obligations he had told no one about, not even Jennifer, not even the wife he had shared a home with for 2 decades. His confidence following Robert's death was not simply born of ambition. It was born of desperation, and Sarah's inheritance had looked to him like the only lifeline large enough to save him before his creditors and his lies caught up with him entirely. David filed for divorce on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Sarah's conversation with Charles Whitfield. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her of anything. He simply came home from work early, sat her down at the same kitchen table where her parents had once explained why she couldn't afford a school trip, and told her, in the calm, rehearsed tone of a man who had clearly practiced the words in his car beforehand, that he no longer believed their marriage could survive, that he had felt disconnected from her for years, and that he thought it was best they both moved forward separately. Sarah sat in stunned silence, still raw from burying her father 5 days earlier, unable to understand how the man she had built a life with could choose this exact moment to walk away. She would later learn, through documents that surfaced during the divorce proceedings, that David had already consulted a divorce attorney the day before, the very same day Sarah had told him only that the estate was larger than expected, a timeline so precise it left no room for any interpretation other than the obvious one. Sarah spent that first week after David's announcement moving through her days in a kind of numb disbelief, calling her mother every evening, unable to eat more than a few bites at any meal, replaying the conversation over and over, searching for a version of it that made sense. Sarah spent that first week after David's announcement moving through her days in a kind of numb disbelief, calling her mother every evening, unable to eat more than a few bites at any meal, replaying the conversation over and over, searching for a version of it that made sense. Her days during that period fell into a strange, hollow routine. She woke early out of habit rather than rest, made coffee she rarely finished, and sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone, half expecting and half dreading a call that never came the way she wanted it to. She stopped returning most texts from mutual friends, unable to summon the energy to explain a situation she barely understood herself. She found herself standing in grocery store aisles some afternoons, cart empty, simply unable to remember what she had come in for, overwhelmed by an ordinary task that had once required no thought at all. Linda would call every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, a small, steady anchor in days that otherwise felt entirely unmoored. Checking in without pressing for details Sarah wasn't ready to share, simply making sure her daughter had eaten something and was still, in whatever fragile way, still standing. She kept waiting for David to call and say he had made a terrible mistake, that grief and stress had clouded his judgment, that he wanted to fix things. The call never came. Instead, exactly 1 week after the divorce filing, exactly 12 days after her father's funeral, Sarah received a call from a mutual friend, hesitant and apologetic, informing her that David and Jennifer had been seen together at a courthouse in Franklin County, and that friends on social media were already congratulating them on a small, private wedding ceremony that had taken place that same afternoon. Sarah remembered feeling the floor tilt beneath her, the specific, disorienting horror of realizing that her husband and her best friend, the two people who had stood beside her at her father's funeral just 11 days earlier, had been planning this moment long before Robert had even passed away. She sat on the floor of her apartment for nearly an hour after that phone call, unable to stand, unable to cry, simply staring at a wall while 30 years of memories rearranged themselves into a shape she no longer recognized. In the days that followed, small details Sarah had never thought to question began surfacing on their own, the way pieces of a puzzle sometimes reveal themselves only once you finally understand what picture you're supposed to be looking for. She remembered a weekend 2 years earlier when David claimed to be fishing with coworkers, only for Sarah to later find a hotel charge on their shared credit card statement in a city nowhere near any lake David had ever mentioned. At the time, she had asked him about it, and he explained it away smoothly, something about a colleague needing to switch plans last minute, an explanation she accepted without a second thought because questioning it had simply never occurred to her as necessary. She found herself now combing back through years of old credit card statements and calendar entries with the cold, methodical eye of someone piecing together a crime scene, finding a dozen small inconsistencies she had explained away one by one over the years, without ever connecting them into the pattern they now so obviously formed. She would later discover, through a mutual acquaintance named Patricia, who finally broke her silence out of guilt several weeks afterward, that David and Jennifer had been quietly involved for nearly 2 years, carrying on an affair that both of them had skillfully hidden behind decades of trusted friendship and 20 years of marriage, using business trips and girls' weekends and late-night work meetings as cover for a relationship that had been building in plain sight the entire time. Patricia reached out first through a brief, hesitant text message asking if she could call, and when Sarah finally answered the phone that evening, Patricia spent the first several minutes simply apologizing before she managed to say anything of substance at all. She explained that she had known, or at least strongly suspected, for well over a year, and that the guilt of her silence had been eating at her steadily in the weeks since the courthouse wedding, especially once she learned how quickly it had all happened after Robert's death. She told Sarah she was calling now because she couldn't stand the thought of Sarah rebuilding her understanding of the past year without the full truth, even if that truth was devastating to hear. Patricia told Sarah, through tears of her own, that she had seen David and Jennifer together at a hotel bar in Chicago during that work trip 18 months earlier. The same trip Sarah had never thought twice about, and that she had convinced herself at the time it was innocent, a coincidence, two old friends catching up, because the alternative had felt too painful and too disloyal to voice aloud. She apologized for her silence, explaining that she had not wanted to be the one to shatter something she wasn't entirely certain about, a decision she now deeply regretted. Sarah did not blame Patricia. She understood, even in her devastation, that everyone around her had been navigating the same impossible choice between comfortable denial and painful honesty, and that David and Jennifer had built their betrayal specifically to exploit that hesitation in the people who loved Sarah most. Jennifer, for her part, never called Sarah to explain herself. There was no confrontation, no tearful confession, no attempt at closure of any kind. She simply vanished from Sarah's life, the way a stranger might, leaving behind a decade of shared memories that Sarah now had to look back on with a completely different, more painful understanding. Every late-night phone call, every shoulder Jennifer had offered during hard times, every secret Sarah had shared about her marriage and her miscarriages and her private fears, all of it now read differently, as reconnaissance rather than friendship, as a woman quietly gathering the exact information she would need to understand David, to comfort him, and eventually to replace his wife entirely. Sarah spent weeks unable to sleep more than a few hours a night, replaying a decade of friendship in her mind, searching for the moment she should have seen it coming, the moment where warmth had quietly curdled into calculation without her ever noticing the shift. The wider circle of mutual friends and extended family who moved through Sarah, David, and Jennifer's overlapping lives reacted with the kind of stunned, uncomfortable fascination that follows any public betrayal of this scale. Some friends quietly reached out to Sarah with support, dropping off meals, sitting with her in silence when she had nothing left to say. Others, uncomfortable with taking sides or perhaps simply unwilling to confront what the situation revealed about how easily people could be fooled, drifted away entirely, uncertain how to remain close to someone without also implicating themselves in the wreckage of what had happened. A few, disturbingly, seemed almost entertained by it, treating Sarah's devastation as neighborhood gossip rather than the genuine grief it was, a cruelty Sarah tried hard not to let harden her further in an already brutal season of loss. David's mother, Carol Callahan, learned of her son's remarriage the same way most of the family's extended circle did, through a photograph posted online rather than a phone call, a detail that reportedly wounded her deeply given the closeness she and Sarah had maintained throughout the marriage. Carol had raised David alone in a small apartment outside Cincinnati, working double shifts as a hospital records clerk to keep him fed and clothed, and she had always privately hoped that Sarah's steady, grounded presence would eventually soften the restless edge she had watched in her son since childhood, an edge she recognized, uncomfortably, as an inheritance from his own absent father. Carol called Sarah directly 2 weeks after the courthouse wedding, tearful and apologetic on David's behalf in a way David himself never once managed to be, telling Sarah that she had raised him better than this and that she was ashamed of the man he had chosen to become. Sarah, still raw from her own grief, found herself in the strange position of comforting her soon-to-be former mother-in-law, a small, unexpected kindness in an otherwise brutal season that Sarah would later say taught her something important about separating the people who had failed her from the people who genuinely loved her and simply happened to be connected to those failures by blood. Sarah's cousin Michelle, who had grown up 2 streets over from the Mitchell family and remained close with Sarah into adulthood, became one of the few people who showed up consistently without needing to be asked, driving in from Cincinnati most weekends simply to sit with Sarah in silence or take her on long, aimless drives through the Ohio countryside when the walls of her apartment became too much to bear. Michelle had known Robert nearly as well as Sarah had, having spent countless childhood summers at the house on Maple Hollow Drive, while her own parents worked long hours, and she carried her own quiet grief over his passing, even as she set it aside to focus entirely on supporting Sarah through the unraveling that followed. She had gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier, one that left her clear-eyed and unsentimental about the particular kind of destruction a spouse's betrayal could leave behind. And she was, by her own admission, the only person in Sarah's life who refused to soften the truth of what David and Jennifer had done. Telling Sarah plainly, during one of their long drives, that grief for a marriage built on lies was not the same as grief for a marriage that had simply ended, and that Sarah owed herself the full, unflinching truth of that distinction if she ever hoped to fully heal from it. It was Michelle who eventually convinced Sarah to block David and Jennifer on every platform, gently pointing out that Sarah did not owe either of them a single moment of her continued attention. And it was Michelle who sat with her the night the courthouse wedding photos first began circulating among their extended social circle, holding Sarah as she finally allowed herself to cry, the way she had been holding back for weeks. Not everyone in their broader circle handled the situation with such grace. A former co-worker of David's named Greg, who had always fancied himself close to both David and Sarah, took to posting vague, gossip-laden comments online that everyone in their shared circle understood to be about the situation, without ever naming names directly, a kind of performative concern that made Sarah feel exposed and picked apart during a period when she most needed privacy. Sarah eventually stopped checking any social platform altogether, asking Michelle and her mother to filter anything she genuinely needed to know, a small boundary that did more to protect her fragile stability in those months than almost anything else she tried. David and Jennifer, meanwhile, appeared entirely unbothered by the social fallout. They moved quickly into a rented townhouse together in a nicer part of Columbus than either of them had previously been able to afford on their own, posted photographs from a brief honeymoon in the Bahamas that Sarah later learned had been charged to yet another line of credit David had quietly opened, and behaved, according to everyone who saw them, like two people who believed they had simply outsmarted the timeline of an old life in order to arrive at a better one far ahead of schedule. David believed that even in divorce, Ohio's marital property laws would entitle him to a substantial share of whatever Sarah inherited during the marriage, a belief he had apparently researched carefully in the months and years before Robert's diagnosis. Jennifer believed that marrying David meant marrying into that same inevitable payout, a fresh start funded, however indirectly, by a fortune she had spent a decade positioning herself close enough to touch. Neither of them understood the trust their new spouse's ex-father-in-law had built. Neither of them had read the fine print, because neither of them had been given the chance to see it before it was already signed, sealed, and quietly waiting, structured years in advance by a man who had, in his own patient and unglamorous way, seen this exact possibility coming long before either of them ever suspected he was capable of building anything at all. The divorce proceedings between Sarah and David unfolded over the following 8 months, longer and far more contentious than either of them likely anticipated when David first filed the paperwork. David's attorney, a sharp litigator named Robert Kessler who specialized in high-asset divorces, aggressively pursued discovery into the full scope of Sarah's inheritance, arguing that even if the trust itself was protected, any income generated from it during the remaining months of the marriage, and any commingled assets from the years David and Sarah had spent building a life together, should be considered fair game under Ohio's equitable distribution laws. Sarah's own attorney, a calm, methodical woman named Diane Farrow, who had handled complex trust litigation for over 20 years, worked alongside Charles Whitfield to demonstrate exactly how airtight Robert's spendthrift trust structure truly was, filing motion after motion establishing that the inheritance had never legally entered the marital estate at all, structured years in advance specifically to avoid any ambiguity on that point. Diane had built her entire career representing spouses, almost always women, on the receiving end of exactly this kind of late marriage financial reckoning, and she told Sarah early in their first meeting that the cases that troubled her most were never the ones involving obvious villains, but the slow, quiet ones, where someone had simply decided, gradually and then all at once, that the person across the dinner table had become an obstacle rather than a partner. She warned Sarah that the coming months would likely feel less like justice and more like exposure, an uncomfortable, clinical dissection of a marriage she had once believed was private, but she promised her that the discomfort would be temporary, and the protection Robert had built would prove permanent. Sarah held on to that promise through some of the hardest weeks of the entire process, repeating it to herself quietly during depositions and filings that otherwise felt designed to make her question every year of her adult life. The depositions were, by every account, brutal. David sat across from Diane Farrow for nearly 6 hours, over 2 separate sessions, questioned in exhaustive detail about the loan he had taken out 18 months earlier, forced to explain, under oath, discrepancies between his stated income and the documents used to secure the loan. Questions he answered with increasing agitation as he realized how much information the investigation Robert commissioned had already uncovered. Sarah attended only the first deposition, sitting quietly at the far end of the conference table, watching the man she had shared 2 decades of her life with grow visibly smaller under the weight of questions he clearly had not expected anyone to ask. She left before the session ended, unable to sit through any more of it, and never attended another deposition for the remainder of the case. The final settlement, reached just short of trial, divided the marital home, the joint retirement accounts David and Sarah had built together over 20 years, and a modest equalization payment reflecting Sarah's higher earning years during the marriage. But it left the entirety of Robert's estate untouched, exactly as the trust had been designed to ensure. David's attorney reportedly advised him privately that pursuing the case further, given what discovery had already revealed about the falsified loan documents, risked drawing federal attention to his finances well before the fraud investigation from the lending institution had even begun in earnest, a warning that turned out to be tragically accurate, since the federal investigation began in full only 4 months after the divorce was finalized. Sarah spent the months following her father's death and her husband's departure in a kind of quiet devastation that she rarely allowed anyone to see. She moved out of the home she had shared with David and into a modest apartment near her mother in Dayton, choosing, even with $2 billion technically within reach, to live simply while she processed grief, layered upon grief upon grief. She lost her father. She lost her marriage. She lost, in the same brutal month, the woman she had considered her closest friend for over a decade. Linda, still grieving her own husband of 42 years, somehow found the strength to show up every single day for her daughter, cooking simple meals, sitting with her through long silences, reminding her gently that she had survived hard things before and would survive this too, even when neither of them fully believed it in the moment. Friends who reached out often found Sarah polite but distant, unwilling to discuss details, unwilling to perform the kind of public outrage that might have made others more comfortable. She stopped checking social media entirely after seeing the Bahamas photographs, unable to stomach the curated joy of 2 people who had built their happiness on the wreckage of her worst month. She started seeing a grief counselor twice a week, not just for her father, but for the specific, compounded loss of losing 3 foundational relationships in the span of a single season. Her counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, gently pointed out during one session that Sarah kept apologizing for her own grief, as though the size of her father's fortune somehow disqualified her from the right to fall apart, a pattern Dr. Patel encouraged her to notice and release. Over the following months, Dr. Patel helped Sarah untangle a knot of guilt she hadn't even realized she was carrying, the quiet, irrational belief that she should have seen the betrayal coming, that a smarter or more attentive wife would have noticed the signs years earlier. Dr. Patel reminded her, session after session, that the architecture of the deception had been built specifically to be invisible to her, constructed over years by 2 people who understood her trusting nature intimately and used it deliberately against her, and that the failure belonged entirely to them, not to her capacity for love. Sarah found this reframing slow to fully absorb, the kind of truth that had to be relearned dozens of times before it finally settled somewhere permanent. But by early spring, nearly 6 months after her father's death, she noticed she had gone an entire week without crying for the first time since the funeral. A small, quiet milestone she mentioned to no one, but wrote down carefully in a journal Dr. Patel had encouraged her to keep. What no one around her realized, not even Linda at first, was that Sarah was quietly waiting, because Charles Whitfield had begun the slow, careful process of walking her through the complete terms of the trust her father had constructed, a process that would take several months to fully unfold. She understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than any comfort from friends could have, that David and Jennifer's confidence was about to collide with a reality neither of them had prepared for, and that she did not need to seek revenge, because her father had already built it into the architecture of his final wishes years before either of them ever showed their true colors. Word of the estate's true size eventually became part of the public record once the probate filing was processed, as is required by Ohio law regardless of how private a family wishes to remain, and the modest community of Dayton reacted with a kind of stunned, almost affectionate disbelief once the local paper ran a short story on it several months later. Neighbors who had waved to Robert every morning for 30 years as he left for his maintenance shift found themselves re-evaluating every small interaction they'd ever had with him, the times he'd quietly fixed a widow's furnace down the street without charging her, the times he'd shown up unannounced with his toolbox during a hard winter to check on elderly neighbors' pipes. A local news reporter interviewed several of these neighbors for a short follow-up piece, and nearly every one of them said some version of the same thing, that knowing what Robert had truly been worth changed nothing about how they remembered him, because the man they knew had never once behaved as though he believed himself better than anyone around him. Sarah found the public reaction to her father's story oddly comforting in the weeks after it broke, a reminder that the version of Robert Mitchell she had loved her entire life, humble, steady, quietly generous, had never been a performance at all, only a portion of a much larger truth that had simply never needed to be spoken aloud. It was the version of himself Robert had chosen to live inside every single day for 30 years, regardless of what he was quietly capable of affording. And Sarah found herself, in the months that followed, trying to hold on to that same instinct in how she chose to live with her own inheritance, letting the money exist quietly in the background of a life still built primarily around the values he had spent decades teaching her. 6 months after Robert's death, Charles Whitfield called Sarah into his office one final time to walk her through the complete terms of the trust in full detail. What Robert had built was not simply a will dividing assets. It was a carefully worded instrument, drafted years in advance and revised several times over the decade before his diagnosis, that included a provision specifically addressing what would happen if Sarah's marriage ended within a defined period following his death. Robert, through decades of quiet observation, had apparently harbored doubts about David long before Sarah ever voiced any herself. Doubts he had never shared aloud, but had instead translated directly into legal protection. The trust stipulated that any portion of the estate inherited by Sarah would be held in an irrevocable, spendthrift trust structure explicitly designed to be excluded from marital property under Ohio law, meaning that regardless of when or how Sarah's marriage ended, David would have no legal claim to any portion of it whatsoever. Charles explained that Robert had first raised this exact scenario with him nearly 8 years earlier, long before David had shown any outward sign of the ambition and resentment that would eventually consume him, and that Robert had revised the language of the trust no fewer than 4 times over the following years, each revision slightly tightening the protections around Sarah's inheritance. The trust stipulated that any portion of the estate inherited by Sarah would be held in an irrevocable spendthrift trust structure explicitly designed to be excluded from marital property under Ohio law, meaning that regardless of when or how Sarah's marriage ended, David would have no legal claim to any portion of it whatsoever. Charles explained that Robert had first raised this exact scenario with him nearly 8 years earlier, long before David had shown any outward sign of the ambition and resentment that would eventually consume him, and that Robert had revised the language of the trust no fewer than 4 times over the following years, each revision slightly tightening the protections around Sarah's inheritance. Charles walked Sarah through the mechanics of the structure in careful, deliberate language, explaining that the trust named an independent corporate trustee rather than Sarah herself as the controlling party over the principal, with Sarah entitled to discretionary distributions for health, education, maintenance, and support, a common structure among ultra-high net worth families, specifically because it created an additional legal barrier between the assets and any future creditor or divorcing spouse. He explained that Robert had also included what attorneys sometimes referred to informally as a bad actor clause, language that would immediately and permanently terminate any distribution rights for a beneficiary's spouse found to have engaged in fraud, deception, or concealment of material financial information during the marriage. A clause so specific and unusual that Charles admitted he had never once drafted anything quite like it in his entire career, and had only agreed to include it after Robert insisted, explaining that he wanted no ambiguity whatsoever if his instincts about David ever proved correct. But there was more, and this was the part of the conversation that would eventually reach far beyond the quiet walls of Charles Whitfield's office. Charles walked Sarah through the specific findings with the careful, measured tone of a man who understood exactly how much weight the information carried. The loan, originating from a private lending firm in Cleveland, totaled just over $400,000, secured using pay stubs and tax documents that David had altered to inflate his actual income by nearly 3 times its true value. The investments David funneled that money into, a series of speculative cryptocurrency ventures and an unregulated commercial real estate fund run by a man, later revealed to be operating an elaborate scheme of his own, had collapsed entirely within a year, leaving David not just unable to repay the loan, but facing mounting interest, aggressive collection efforts, and the very real possibility of criminal exposure for the falsified documents that had secured it in the first place. When this information became part of the public record during the eventual divorce proceedings and the separate investigation that followed, the full picture of David's financial situation was exposed in a way neither he nor Jennifer could control or contain. The falsified loan documents constituted clear financial fraud, a fact that triggered a formal investigation by the lending institution, which forwarded its findings to federal prosecutors given the interstate nature of the transaction. David was charged with wire fraud and making false statements to obtain a loan, charges that would result in a lengthy legal battle, a restitution obligation exceeding the original loan amount once penalties and interest were included, and eventually a plea agreement that carried the very real threat of prison time hanging over him for years. The federal case against David moved slowly through the following year, as these cases often do, with an initial indictment, a lengthy period of pretrial motions, and eventually a plea agreement that spared him a full trial in exchange for a guilty plea, to reduce charges, a restitution obligation exceeding $600,000 once penalties and accrued interest were calculated, and 18 months in a federal facility. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray Wednesday morning in a federal courthouse in Columbus, attended by a small handful of people. David's mother, Carol, his defense attorney, and a single reporter from a local business publication that had been quietly following the case since the initial indictment. David addressed the judge briefly, reading from a prepared statement that expressed regret for his actions without ever fully naming what those actions had cost the people around him, a distinction the judge noted directly before handing down the sentence, remarking that genuine accountability required more than acknowledging that mistakes were made in the passive voice. Carol Callahan sat in the second row throughout the hearing, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and left the courthouse without speaking to reporters, driving home alone to the same small apartment outside Cincinnati where she had raised David decades earlier, carrying a grief that Sarah, in a strange and complicated way, understood better than almost anyone else could have. Jennifer, who had married David believing she was marrying into stability and, eventually, a share of a fortune she had spent a decade quietly positioning herself close enough to touch, found herself instead married to a man facing federal fraud charges, a failed investment portfolio, and a mountain of debt that had been carefully hidden from her as well, right up until the moment it could no longer be hidden from anyone. Court documents would later reveal that Jennifer herself had been unaware of the true extent of David's debt until the fraud investigation became public, a discovery that reportedly triggered the first serious conflict of their brand-new marriage, one that friends described as explosive, occurring in the same rented townhouse they had moved into, with such confidence only months earlier. According to Michelle, who still maintained a few distant contacts within their old shared social circle, Jennifer learned of the federal investigation the same way most of the couple's friends did, through a brief, clinical phone call from David's newly appointed defense attorney requesting a meeting to discuss potential exposure to Jennifer's own assets given her status as his spouse. Jennifer reportedly sat in stunned silence through most of that call, only fully grasping the scale of what she had married into when the attorney calmly explained that federal restitution obligations could, under certain circumstances, extend to jointly held marital assets, meaning the modest savings Jennifer had carried into the marriage were themselves now at risk because of debts she had never known existed. The townhouse they had moved into together, the honeymoon photographs from the Bahamas, The entire performance of a fresh start funded by assumed future wealth. All of it began collapsing within weeks of the wedding neither of them had waited even a month to rush into. The federal case against David moved slowly through the following year, as these cases often do, with an initial indictment, a lengthy period of pre-trial motions, and eventually a plea agreement that spared him a full trial in exchange for a guilty plea to reduce charges, a restitution obligation exceeding $600,000 once penalties and accrued interest were calculated, and 18 months in a federal facility. Jennifer filed for divorce from David 9 months into their marriage, citing irreconcilable differences in a filing that made no mention of fraud or debt, though everyone who had watched the story unfold understood exactly what had truly ended it. She moved back into a small apartment on her own, declining to comment publicly on any of it, and largely disappeared from the social circles she and Sarah had once shared for over a decade. Michelle heard, secondhand and nearly 2 years after everything had settled, that Jennifer had left Ohio entirely, relocating to a smaller city in North Carolina where no one knew the particulars of what had happened, taking a position managing a dental office much like the one she had worked at before, quietly rebuilding a life stripped of the fortune she had once believed was within reach. Sarah felt, when she heard this, not the satisfaction she might have once imagined feeling, but something closer to a distant, complicated sadness, the recognition that a decade of real friendship, however it had ultimately been corrupted, could not simply be erased without leaving some residue of grief behind it, even for the person who had caused the wound in the first place. The fortune Jennifer believed she had positioned herself to eventually share in never materialized, not because Sarah withheld it out of spite, but because it had never legally belonged to David in the first place, protected years in advance by a father who had seen this exact moment coming, with a clarity neither David nor Jennifer ever gave him credit for. The marriage they had built on speed and certainty instead became a slow, public unraveling, playing out across small claims filings, restitution hearings, and eventually a second divorce, this one far messier and far more publicly humiliating than the first, as Jennifer sought to distance herself legally and financially from a man now facing federal charges she had never signed up for. Sarah did not celebrate David and Jennifer's downfall the way a lesser story might suggest she should. She did not gloat. She did not reach out to remind them of what her father had built, or of the fine print they had failed to read before they moved so quickly to claim a future that was never theirs to claim. She simply moved forward, quietly using a portion of her inheritance to establish a scholarship fund at the same Dayton high school she had once attended, named for the father who had spent 30 years pretending to have less than he did in order to teach his daughter something more valuable than money itself. A fund that would go on, over the following years, to send dozens of students from families like the one she grew up in to college debt-free. She also, gradually, allowed herself to rebuild a life defined by her own terms rather than the terms of a marriage built on assumptions she had never known to question. She traveled, quietly and without fanfare, to places she had always wanted to see but never felt she could afford. A 2-week trip through Portugal with Michelle that spring. A solo week in the mountains outside Denver that summer, learning slowly what it felt like to make decisions based entirely on her own preferences, rather than the quiet, constant calculus of managing someone else's moods. She reconnected with old friends she had drifted from during her marriage, women who had known her before David, before the careful performance of a happy household began to consume so much of her energy. She left her marketing job the following spring, not out of financial necessity, but out of a growing desire to build something of her own, rather than continue climbing a ladder that had never quite fit her, and enrolled in a part-time program studying nonprofit management, eventually taking a hands-on role, helping run the very scholarship foundation established in her father's name. It was work that felt, for the first time in years, entirely aligned with who she actually was, rather than who she had slowly molded herself into becoming across 2 decades of marriage. She dated cautiously, almost a full 2 years after the divorce was finalized, allowing herself to move at whatever pace felt honest, rather than rushing to prove anything to anyone, including herself. When she did eventually begin seeing someone, a soft-spoken high school science teacher named Marcus, who had grown up in a family not unlike her own, she found herself watching him closely, in a way she never had with David, paying quiet attention to how he treated waiters, how he spoke about his own family's modest means, how he reacted the one time she mentioned, carefully and without detail, that her late father's estate was significant. Marcus had simply nodded, asked no follow-up questions, and changed the subject back to the movie they were about to watch. A small, unremarkable moment that told Sarah more about his character than months of grand gestures ever could have. 1 year after her father's funeral, Sarah stood on the same back porch where Robert had once told her that people show you who they really are the moment they believe no one important is watching. She had kept the house on Maple Hollow Drive rather than sell it, unable to imagine strangers living inside the walls that held so much of what her father had quietly given up in order to protect her. Linda still visited every Sunday, and the two of them had fallen into a new, gentler rhythm together, no longer just mother and daughter, but two women who had survived the same impossible year and come out the other side of it still standing. The vegetable garden Robert had tended for 30 years was back in bloom that spring. Tomatoes and green beans climbing the same worn wooden stakes he had driven into the soil himself, tended now by Sarah's own hands on weekend mornings, when the quiet felt more like peace than emptiness. The scholarship fund established in Robert's name had already sent its first 6 students to college debt-free by that first anniversary. Each of them chosen not for perfect grades or polished essays, but for the same quiet resilience Charles Whitfield had helped Sarah build into the selection criteria. A preference for young people who had worked evening and weekend jobs to help support their families. The same kind of struggle Robert himself had known intimately as a young man in West Virginia. Sarah attended the small scholarship dinner that spring in a modest dress rather than anything designed to announce the scale of the fortune behind it, greeting each student personally, telling them only that the fund was named for a man who believed struggle, handled with patience and honesty, built better character than comfort ever could. One of the recipients, a quiet young woman named Destiny who had spent her high school years working weekend shifts at a laundromat to help her single mother make rent, approached Sarah at the end of the dinner and asked, a little nervously, what Robert Mitchell had actually done for a living. Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember, telling Destiny simply that her father had fixed things for people and that he had believed, more than almost anything else, that the people who worked hardest for the least recognition were usually the ones who deserved the most faith placed in them. She did not mention the $2 billion. She did not need to. Destiny nodded, seeming to understand something true in the answer, regardless of the specifics behind it. And Sarah realized, watching her walk back to her table, that she had just passed along, without quite planning to, the exact same lesson her father had spent 30 years quietly teaching her. In the years that followed, Sarah made a deliberate choice to keep the foundation's giving as quiet as Robert had kept his own for decades, declining interview requests from local media, refusing to attach her name prominently to any building or program the fund supported, choosing instead to let the help simply arrive the way it always had for the families Robert had touched anonymously for 20 years before anyone ever knew his true name deserved to be on any of it. She learned, in the aftermath of losing her father, her marriage, and her closest friendship in the span of a single devastating season, that trust is not something you extend based on how long someone has been in your life, but based on how they behave when they believe no one important is watching. Her father had understood this decades before she did. In the end, his final gift was never really about the money at all. It was about teaching his daughter, one final time, exactly who deserved to stand beside her, and exactly who never did. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing the version of your life you believed was solid had in fact been quietly hollowed out for years before it finally collapsed. And there is a different, sharper kind of grief that comes from realizing you were protected from that collapse not by luck, but by the deliberate, decades-long sacrifice of a parent who never once asked for credit. Sarah carried both of these griefs simultaneously for a long time, unable to fully separate the loss of her father from the loss of her marriage and friendship, unable to decide which wound deserved more of her attention on any given day. It was only in the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding, therapy sessions, and quiet mornings in the garden, and long drives with Michelle through the Ohio countryside, that she came to understand the three losses were never truly separate at all. Her father's death had simply removed the last obstacle standing between David and Jennifer and the future they had already decided they wanted. And in that sense, the same silence that had once protected her as a child had, in its final act, exposed exactly who around her had been waiting patiently for an opportunity all along. What strikes so many people about stories like this one is not simply the scale of the betrayal, but the ordinariness of the people who carried it out. David was not a cartoonish villain twirling a mustache in the shadows. He was a man who worked hard, who genuinely loved his wife for many years, who slowly, quietly allowed resentment and financial desperation to convince him that dishonesty was simply a means to an end he deserved to reach. Jennifer was not a scheming outsider, circling from a distance. She was a real friend, present for real grief, whose own quiet envy curdled over years into something she likely never planned from the very beginning, but drifted toward one small compromise at a time. This, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable truth this story has to offer. Betrayal this complete rarely announces itself in advance. It grows slowly, in small, unnoticed moments, until it is standing fully formed in your kitchen, telling you it no longer believes your marriage can survive. Was Robert Mitchell wrong to hide his fortune from his own daughter for 30 years? Or did his quiet, painful decision ultimately protect her from two people who would have destroyed her the moment real money entered the picture? Would you have made the same choice in his position, knowing what it might cost the people you loved most in the meantime? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Before we dive deeper into more stories like this one, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.